July 1944. Normandy had just fallen quiet after weeks of relentless fighting. In the chaos of surrender and evacuation, a group of German Red Cross nurses emerged from a makeshift underground hospital. They expected to be treated as criminals. Instead, they were about to face the greatest shock of their lives. Not hatred, not violence, but a word they had never imagined hearing from their captors. Colleagues. The 9 women were exhausted beyond comprehension. They had spent the previous month treating grievous wounds by candlelight, reusing bandages, and rationing the last ampules of morphine. Their uniforms were threadbare, their faces lined with soot and strain. For days, the rumble of American artillery had shaken the hospital walls, and rumors whispered through the tunnels. Surrender was inevitable. When the order finally came to surface, the nurses filed out in silence, their white armbands stained with blood. They carried no weapons, only their medical satchels. Every step was heavy with dread. They knew the stories. American soldiers would shoot prisoners, or worse. The Reich had drilled it into them. Capture meant dishonor, humiliation, perhaps even execution. But what awaited them in the daylight was not jeering guards or rough treatment. It was the steady gaze of Colonel Richard P. Johnson, commanding officer of the 45th Evacuation Hospital. A physician by training, he looked at them not as enemies, but as professionals, people who, like his own nurses, had sworn to preserve life in the middle of death. At first, the German nurses could not comprehend what they saw. The American field hospital stretched across a meadow outside Cherbourg, a city battered by weeks of siege. Long white tents stood in ordered rows. Generators hummed, providing bright electric light. Trucks delivered crates of supplies stacked higher than a man. Inside, they glimpsed an opera, theatre, illuminated by surgical lamps with sterilizers steaming in the corner, tables covered in stainless steel instruments. They saw shelves stocked with bandages still in their wrappers, cabinets filled with bottles of medicine they had only read about in textbooks. It was like walking from the Middle Ages into the future. Nurse Elsa Müller, barely 24, whispered to her colleague, "This is impossible. We were told the Americans were backward, starving, primitive, but look at this." Her words hung in the air. Colonel Johnson addressed them calmly through an interpreter. He explained that under the Geneva Convention, medical personnel would be treated with respect. They would not be executed, they would not be humiliated. Instead, they would continue their vocation, caring for the wounded. One of the Germans, Greta Falk, couldn't contain herself. "You mean, we will be allowed to work?" The interpreter nodded. Johnson's voice was firm. "You are nurses. You understand suffering. You know what it means to save a life. That makes you our colleagues." The word struck like lightning. Colleagues, not prisoners, not enemies. Colleagues. The women exchanged bewildered glances. For years they had been indoctrinated with the idea that Americans were barbarians, devoid of culture or morality. Yet here was an American colonel, regarding them as equals in the most sacred profession they knew. Within hours, the nurses were led into the wards. What they witnessed broke every expectation. Rows of American soldiers lay in clean beds, each with fresh sheets. Intravenous drips hung beside them, delivering plasma with precise labels for blood type and expiration dates. In Germany, blood transfusions were still often done directly, donor to patient, with dangerous outcomes. Here, the process was standardized, efficient, and safe. The German nurses were asked to assist. Hesitant hands touched unfamiliar equipment, glass syringes with precise calibrations, stethoscopes of superior design, sterilized scalpels glinting under electric light. An American surgeon, noticing their hesitation, smiled and gestured, "Sister, would you hold this clamp?" The translator repeated the word, but the intent was clear. They were being integrated into the team. Emotional conflict. At night, the nurses gathered in their assigned quarters, tents with cots, wool blankets, even hot meals. Elsa broke down in tears. "How can this be real?" she whispered. "At home, my family eats turnips and black bread. Here, prisoners are fed meat, milk, even chocolate." Greta's voice was bitter. "Our leaders told us the Americans were weak, but I think they lied to us." No one argued. The evidence surrounded them in every detail: the abundance of food, the efficiency of logistics, the endless supplies of medicine. Their entire world-view was collapsing. Respect that stung. The most disorienting moments were not the meals or the technology, but the respect. American nurses, women in starched uniforms, treated them with courtesy, even warmth. They asked questions, compared techniques, shared advice. One evening, Lieutenant Helen Morrison, a senior American nurse, sat with the Germans during supper. Through halting German and the help of an interpreter, she asked about their training. In Germany, nursing was sub-det, ordinate to doctors bound by rigid hierarchy. In America, Morrison explained, nurses had autonomy. They could question orders, propose alternatives, even refuse unsafe practices. The Germans listened in disbelief. The idea of challenging a doctor was unthinkable in the Reich. Yet here, nurses were expected to advocate for their patients. "You are responsible," Morrison said simply. "You are not just assistants, you are professionals." The German women sat in stunned silence. A new kind of war. As days turned into weeks, the psychological strain deepened. Each surgery they assisted in, each patient they tended, drove the wedge further between propaganda and reality. They had expected scorn. Instead, they were invited to morning briefings, introduced by name, asked for input. American doctors addressed them directly. "Nurse Müller, what do you recommend?" Every time, the word nurse, spoken without derision, cut through the old indoctrination. They were no longer tools of ideology. They were healers again. The first week passed in a haze of disbelief. The German nurses found themselves immersed in the routines of the 45th Evacuation Hospital. Each morning they received assignments as if they belonged. Instead of hostility, the American staff greeted them with nods and professional instructions. The language barrier slowed conversations, but medicine spoke a universal dialect. A fever spike, a hemorrhage, a weak pulse. These required no translation. For Elsa Müller, the surreal moment came when a young American orderly handed her a clipboard and said, through gestures, "You sign." The sheet bore her name, written in neat block letters by the Americans themselves. She stared at it for long seconds. She was not invisible. She was not a faceless prisoner. She was a nurse with responsibilities. The supplies that never ran out. In Germany, they had measured every bandage, every drop of morphine, like gold dust. They washed and re-washed cotton strips until the fibers frayed to nothing. But here the supply tents overflowed. Crates of sterile gauze, bottles of alcohol, ampules of penicillin stacked like cordwood. The German nurses gasped when they saw plasma bottles suspended on hooks, tubing delivering lifeblood into wounded soldiers. In their field hospitals, transfusions had been risky improvisations, donor-to-patient connections that often ended in tragedy. Here, the process was precise, safe, and repeatable. "Mein Gott," whispered Greta Falk. "They treat even the lowest-ranked soldier like a general." Cultural collision at the bedside. One afternoon, Elsa tended to a wounded paratrooper whose bandages needed changing. The surgeon, Dr. William Carter, entered the ward and asked her opinion, through the interpreter. "What do you think, Sister Müller? Do we remove the sutures now or wait another day?" Elsa froze. A doctor had asked her opinion. In Germany, such a moment would have been unthinkable. Nurses followed orders, no questions, no debate. But here, an American colonel looked at her as though her experience mattered. She stammered through the interpreter. I believe one more day will reduce risk. Dr. Carter smiled. Good. We'll wait. The weight of that exchange crushed her. She was not only being allowed to participate, she was being trusted. Evenings of comparison. At night, the German nurses sat together in their quarters, whispering in disbelief. Did you see the sterilizers? One asked. They can purify a full load of instruments in minutes. Our autoclaves take hours. They waste nothing of time, another replied. But of supplies, they waste everything. They throw bandages away after one use. One use. In Berlin, my mother tears sheets into strips. They wrestled with the contradiction. How could a nation so wealthy, so technologically advanced, be described in propaganda as primitive? How had their leaders believed this war could ever be won? The moment of kindness. One evening, a soldier died despite every effort. The German nurse who had attended him, Anna Keller, stood by the bed, trembling. She had done everything she could, but the infection had spread too far before his evacuation. She braced herself for blame, perhaps even scorn. Instead, Lieutenant Morrison placed a hand on Anna's shoulder and said quietly, "You did good work, sister. Sometimes, even here, we lose them." The interpreter relayed the words, but Anna had already understood. The tone, the compassion, the acknowledgement of effort. This was the voice of a colleague. Tears slid down her face, not just for the lost soldier, but for the collapse of every barrier she had been taught to believe in. Not all moments were easy. During one lunch, the Americans served the nurses meatloaf, potatoes, butter, and milk. Elsa pushed her tray away in anguish. "How can I eat this," she said, "when my brothers starve at the front?" The American nurse beside her hesitated, then replied, "That is why this war will end. Because we have enough to feed prisoners what your leaders cannot feed their own soldiers." The bluntness stung. Elsa stared down at the food, torn between hunger and guilt. She took a single bite, and it tasted of betrayal. Letters that could not be sent, the Americans provided stationery, envelopes, and postage. "You may write home," they said. But what could they write? "We are prisoners, but we eat 3 meals a day. We are prisoners, but we sleep on clean cots. We are prisoners, but we are treated as equals." Every sentence would sound like treason if it reached Germany. So the women wrote half-truths. "We are alive. We are together. We are safe." They did not add the secret that haunted them. "And we are respected." A new definition of nursing. The greatest revelation came when they shadowed American nurses on rounds. Here, nurses carried charts, made decisions, corrected orderlies, even questioned doctors. They worked with an independence that was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Back home," Greta whispered, "we are shadows. Here, they are light." They saw American nurses not as silent assistants, but as professionals with voices. The Germans, trained in silence, began to find their own. Again and again the word returned. Colleagues. It came from surgeons who asked their help. It came from patients who clasped their hands and whispered thanks. It came from nurses who shared techniques, showed them new sterilization procedures, explained dosage calculations. Every time the word was spoken, the walls of ideology crumbled further. These Americans did not see the Boer as enemies. They saw them as healers. And in that recognition, the German women glimpsed a truth more devastating than defeat. Their enemy's humanity was greater than their leaders had ever admitted. By autumn of 1944, the tide of war had shifted decisively. The German nurses, once confined to field hospitals in Normandy, were transferred with other POW medical staff to ships bound for the United States. The voyage itself was an education. They boarded a Liberty ship, one of the mass-produced cargo vessels the Americans churned out by the hundreds. Its medical bay, bright with electric lamps, stocked with refrigerated plasma and sterilized equipment, surpassed anything the nurses had seen even in Berlin's teaching hospitals. Each ship is a hospital, Elsa whispered to Anna as they examined the sick bay. How could we ever believe they were weak? For days at sea, they watched American crewmen casually discard half-eaten meals, while German soldiers back home boiled weeds for soup. The abundance was not rumor. It was reality. When the Statue of Liberty appeared on the horizon, a strange silence fell over the captured medical staff. Propaganda had painted America as a crumbling, starving land. Instead, the skyline of New York bristled with skyscrapers, neon signs, and bridges larger than any in Europe. At the dock, Red Cross volunteers handed out cigarettes, soap, even chocolate bars. One German nurse whispered, "They treat prisoners better than our hospitals treat civilians." From New York, trains carried them inland. Every stop revealed more shocks: rows of modern hospitals in Philadelphia, vast university medical complexes in Richmond, illuminated city blocks stretching further than Berlin's avenues. The American nurses traveling with them pointed to the glowing structures. "That is the Medical College of Virginia," one said proudly. The Germans could only stare, overwhelmed by the scale. In September 1944, they reached Camp Opelika, one of the first large POW facilities to receive medical personnel. Here, for the first time, the Germans were placed in a dual staff, F system. American officers supervised, but German doctors and nurses continued treating their own wounded. The shock was immediate. The camp hospital rivaled any civilian facility in Germany. Autoclaves sterilized equipment in minutes. Surgical lamps could be adjusted with a fingertip. The pharmacy shelves bulged with drugs: quinine, sulfur, insulin, each carefully labeled with expiration dates. Elsa ran her fingers along the bottles. "Do you realize," she whispered, "these medicines expire unused, while in Hamburg children die for lack of them?" The most disorienting experience came when the German nurses were assigned to work under African-American medical personnel. Nazi ideology had drilled into them the belief that non-Europeans were inferior, incapable of higher learning. Yet here, black nurses carried themselves with authority, corrected German techniques, and demonstrated superior knowledge of procedures. At first, resentment flared. "How can I take orders from her?" Greta hissed after being instructed by Lieutenant Eleanor Powell, an African-American nurse. But resentment gave way to humiliation, then to revelation. Powell's expertise was undeniable. She performed IV insertions with steady precision, read X-rays fluently, and instructed German staff without arrogance. One evening, after Powell corrected Elsa's dressing technique, Elsa confessed to her peers, "If our Reich taught us these women are inferior, then our Reich lied. They know more than we do." The realization cut deep. Propaganda had not only distorted America, it had distorted humanity itself. If one invention symbolized America's advantage, it was penicillin. By 1944, US factories produced billions of units. In Germany, antibiotics were scarce, almost mythical. At Opelika, the German nurses witnessed infections vanish in days. A soldier with gangrene, whose leg they would have amputated back home, walked again after treatment. Pneumonia cases, once fatal, resolved with injections. Dr. Mitchell, the American supervisor, placed a vial of penicillin into into Elsa's hand. "This is why we win," she said. Elsa turned the glass ampule over in her palm. It was clear, odorless, ordinary, and yet it represented a chasm of decades. She whispered, "We are still in the past. They are already in the future." The holiday season deepened the psychological collapse. At Camp Opelika, American staff organized a Christmas feast, not only for their own, but for German prisoners as well. Turkeys, hams, pies, vegetables, coffee, chocolate. The tables groaned under abundance. Local churches sent choirs to sing carols in German. Boy Scouts delivered handmade cards. Prisoners unwrapped gifts of soap, socks, and candy. For Anna, it was unbearable. She wept into her hands as American volunteers handed toys to German children interned with their parents. Her own family in Hamburg wrote of eating bark and straw, of neighbours buried in rubble. The contrast was more painful than starvation. "Is this victory?" she whispered. "Or is this mercy?" By 1945, the US Army launched Special Projects programs designed to educate POWs in democratic principles. The nurses attended lectures on medical ethics, patient rights, and the scientific method. Professor James Thompson, a volunteer instructor, asked the Germans what they had learned about American society. Greta answered bitterly, "That you are primitive, disorganized, starving." Thompson smiled sadly. "And what do you see now?" She gestured helplessly at the sterilizers, the plasma banks, the endless supplies. "I see that everything we were told was a lie." In Germany, nursing education had included racial science, heredity charts, ideology that the weak should perish. But in Opelika's hospital, the Germans saw the opposite. American doctors treated enemy POWs with the same care as their own wounded. Black and white staff worked side by side, united by professionalism. This was not just a defeat of arms. It was the collapse of an entire worldview. By early 1945, thunderous news swept through every camp. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. For the German nurses at Camp Opelika, whispers of collapse reached them even before official bulletins. Letters from home were scarcer, more desperate. "We boil potato peels for soup," one mother wrote. Another, "The house is gone. We live in rubble." Inside the camp hospital, life went on. Sterile wards, surgeries, medical lectures, and a steady rhythm of abundance. The Germans were torn between two worlds, the starving homeland in their letters and the America before their eyes, with refrigerators humming and plasma kept cold by machines that never failed. Then came the films. American officers showed reels from newly liberated concentration camps. At first, the Germans muttered denials. Propaganda, they thought, but the images were too detailed, the testimonies too raw. Piles of emaciated corpses, survivors with sunken eyes, gas chambers, crematoria, registers of names. Elsa turned away, shaking. "This cannot be real." Anna whispered, "If they lied about America, perhaps they lied about this too. But what if they didn't?" For medical staff who had been trained to heal, the realization was unbearable. Their government had twisted medicine into a weapon of death. In the American hospitals, they saw medicine used as it should be, to heal anyone, enemy or friend. The contrast was a wound that would never fully close. On May 8th, the announcement reached Camp Opelika, unconditional surrender. The war was over. For the German nurses, cheers from their captors echoed like thunder. They themselves felt only numbness. Colonel Henry W. Mish addressed them. "The war is finished, but your work is not. You will carry back what you have learned. Do not forget it." The nurses realized then that they were not just prisoners. They had been students in the largest classroom imaginable. American authorities began structured education for returnees. The nurses received lectures in public health, epidemic control, vaccination programs, and emergency relief. They practiced documenting cases, learning triage systems, even water purification and nutrition programs for malnourished civilians. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who had overseen them from France to Opelika, told them directly, "You will return to a shattered land. These skills will matter more than uniforms or flags. You will be needed." One by one, the nurses received certificates of training, paper, ink, and signatures, but also a symbol. Proof that America considered them not as enemies, but as medical professionals worth investing in. The last evening in camp was heavy with emotion. Lieutenant Helen Morrison gathered the women. "You were our prisoners, but you were also our colleagues. Remember that word when you go home. Anna clutched her certificate as though it were a lifeline. Elsa wept openly. Greta whispered, "If only our leaders had seen what we have seen." For many, the hardest parting was from the African-American nurses who had trained them. The irony was bitter. The Reich had branded these women as inferior, yet they had proven to be patient, skilled teachers who dismantled centuries of prejudice in weeks. Elsa promised Eleanor Powell, "I will tell others what I have learned, even if they do not believe me." In late 1945, transport ships carried the nurses back across the Atlantic. They disembarked in Bremerhaven to find a land they barely recognized. Entire cities lay in ruins, blackened shells where hospitals had once stood. Civilians shuffled in patched rags, children begged for scraps. Elsa wrote in her diary, "We left abundance, we returned to ash." When she reported to a makeshift hospital in Hamburg, she unpacked the American medical bag given to her by Dr. Mitchell. Syringes, scalpels, even a thermometer. Colleagues stared in awe. These tools looked like miracles. The returning nurses found themselves in impossible conditions, wards overflowing with bomb victims, malnutrition cases, epidemic outbreaks. Supplies were scarce, but they applied American techniques, boiling water for sterilization, organizing triage, implementing record-keeping, insisting on documentation of symptoms. At first, German doctors resisted. "Why should we follow American methods?" they scoffed. Elsa held her ground. Because they work. Because they save lives. When penicillin arrived through Allied relief channels, the nurses already knew its power. They administered doses with confidence, shocking their colleagues. "How do you know this?" the doctors asked. Elsa answered quietly, "Because in captivity we were taught." Not everyone welcomed them. Neighbors whispered that they were traitors, that they had grown soft in American hands. But the nurses knew what they had witnessed. They had seen respect across enemy lines. They had been called colleagues. No accusation could erase that. Greta, summoned before an Allied commission, testified, "I was told Americans were primitive, but they treated me with more dignity than my own officers. They showed me what medicine truly is, service to all humanity." In the years that followed, many of these nurses took leadership roles in rebuilding German hospitals and nursing schools. They introduced nursing autonomy, documentation practices, and patient advocacy, concepts borrowed directly from American models. They fought to move nursing out of silence and into professionalism. By the 1950s, German pharmaceutical companies adopted quality standards inspired by what returnees had observed in captivity. Blood banks were established following American protocols. Nursing schools shifted curricula away from racial ideology toward scientific training. The ripple effects were vast. Each nurse trained dozens more. Each reform, its hospital treated thousands. In this way, the word colleague echoed through generations. In 1995, survivors gathered to commemorate the 50th anniversary of their captivity. Elsa Müller, now elderly, opened her worn diary and read aloud the words she had written in 1945. "We were captured. We were not humiliated. We were called colleagues. From that moment, I understood that victory is not only measured in guns, but in compassion. Medicine corrupted by ideology becomes death. Medicine guided by science and respect becomes life." Tears filled the eyes of those listening, German, American, and younger generations alike. The story of the captured German nurses is not only about captivity. It is about the collapse of illusions. They entered American hospitals expecting punishment and degradation. Instead, they were given a seat at the table, instruments in hand, names on charts, and, most importantly, a title: colleagues. This single word tore down walls of propaganda more effectively than any bombardment. It demonstrated that dignity can conquer ideology, and that the greatest victory of all is to turn enemies into professionals working side by side to heal.